Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to have a look at how we can make our UI sing with neon and glowy kind of effects. So this tutorial was really going to be looking at the CSS of some of the widgets that we've got on the screen already. With that said, you don't necessarily need to know anything about HTML or CSS or the widgets or things like that, as I'm hoping that this tutorial will be quite a nice entry point to looking at how you can very slightly modify the UI that is already built into lots of templates in Crayta, how you can kind of modify it, add things and change things around, as I think that's quite a nice way into building UI essentially. So the UI system in Crayta is made with HTML5, which is essentially a combination of three things. HTML, which is the content on our UI, things like this picture up here, the actual words and the content itself. CSS, which is the styling of that content, the colors and why it looks the way it looks and whether it's in a square box or a round box or whatever. And JavaScript, which handles the kind of information flow coming from Crayta and then manipulates that information and displays it within the HTML. So kind of the dynamic side of it, the stuff that's going to keep updating is the JavaScript. So we've got HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When we're looking at UI glowy effects, then really we're only really looking at one small part of a widget, and it's not the HTML and it's not the JavaScript, it is the CSS. That's where our styling is, and that's essentially where we're going to be doing most of our work. Don't worry if you don't understand what CSS is or how to write it from scratch, because I'm going to take you through a little bit of a process. Now, this isn't the only way to make glowy effects in UI or in HTML. There's lots of different ways that you could go about doing this, but I'm trying to give you the most straightforward approach that I could think of for adding this kind of effect. So without further ado, I'm in advanced mode because I'm going to need to do a little bit of coding in terms of the widgets. So to get to advanced mode, if you aren't there already, if you're in basic mode, which looks like this, just press tab on your keyboard. You will need to use a keyboard and mouse for this because we're going to be doing a little bit of typing. So now I'm in advanced mode. To edit the widget, first of all, I have to find out what widget it is. So to do that, and most things that are displayed throughout the length of the game are either going to be on the player template, which you can find in our template browser here, or the user template. So it could be in one of those. Let's click on the player template, and in here you can see some of the widgets that we already have inbuilt within this. This was built based on a team deathmatch game. So that already came along with a bunch of widgets that we can use and edit and change. So we've got the overhead one, the player health widget, which is this box down the bottom left, and the inventory. And so you can kind of see by clicking on these different widgets in our player template, they actually show up and give us an example of what that's going to look like on the screen. And they're using the data that's already within the widget, although that will be updated using the JavaScript, as I mentioned. So that's our player template. And we also have a user template, which has its own bunch of widgets. Usually the user widgets are really, when they're not related to the player that's running around in the game world, the user widgets are going to be information for the player who's sitting there playing the game. The player widgets are really regarding the information around that player character. So we've got the HUD, the lobby, results, things like that, and the team that we're on. So the two I'm going to look at is this team thing here, because it's a good way of looking at how we can add a glowy effect to an image. And we're going to have a look at the inventory, specifically the currency box, which is this little green coins box down here. So I'm going to look at two different ways of adding neon-y, glowy CSS effects. Although this will also work with other types of effects, and it's quite just a nice exercise to get into editing the CSS so that it looks a bit different. So let's open up the CSS, the widget code for this player inventory view. So if I click on this script folder within the player, there's two things attached to this. There's the inventory view script, which is the Lua script that handles the logic behind the widget. And there's the widget, which is inventory view widget. And that's where our HTML5 code is going to sit. So let's edit that. And we can do that by clicking on the edit button next to the HTML box here. Edit this asset. Now, I've made it so that my source code, which is this code here, is underneath the view of the widget. And I've done that by selecting Options, Source Editor Split. If you've opened it for the first time, you'll probably see it's like this. But by going Source Editor Split Mode and putting it at the bottom, it means that now I can see both the display and the code. And so in here, I want to change it so that this coins or the currency boxes down here are shiny. So let's start by finding them. Well, those currency boxes, if we go to our HTML code, in our widget is kind of split into three parts. First part is our style, which is our CSS. So between this style tag, that's called a tag in HTML, between that style and this /style, which is our closing tag, between those two tags is all CSS code. And you'll notice it looks different. So HTML uses this kind of tag notation with the less than and greater than symbols, whereas the CSS uses its own notation, its own kind of language. And we'll look at how that relates to the HTML in a second, but just know that they're different for now. The HTML is a different language from the CSS. And so if we go past the end style tag for our CSS, find the body tag, which is the content that is being displayed in this widget. Within there, we need to try and find where this currency box is. And so we can do that by just kind of reading through. So we've got this div called inventory, which is like a div is like a container. So that's the container of our inventory widget. It's like an invisible container. But if I was to set the background of that div to black, it would probably cover the whole screen, where just because that's how we're going to lay out our inventory. And within there, we can find this div, which has got the class of currencies. And that means that essentially this div is looking after those two boxes. So it's the containing element of the coins and gems boxes you see down there. And within there, we have this div here. So this div is called currency, and that represents each one of those. So there's a currency on the left for coins, and there's a currency on the right for gems. This is one currency div, and this is another currency div. We're using the coherent game face to essentially make as many versions of these currency boxes as we need. So if I change my JS model so that we've only got coins and save that, you'll see that the gems box has now disappeared. So it's reactive. It's essentially, yeah, the JavaScript controls how many of those currency boxes we've got. Just know that there's a container called currencies, and there's each one of those divs inside of that, each one of those little boxes inside of that is our currency. So we found our currency box. It's div class currency. Now we need to find the CSS that relates to that. So we've got found our content. So where is our CSS that relates to that specific box? Let's scroll back up to our CSS code. Remember, between the style tags, and we're looking for that currency. So we've got currency-count. That's not it. Here we go. So we've got this div, which is this block of CSS, which is basically styling the position of however many currencies we've got. And then we've got this currency block from there to there, open parentheses, close parentheses. That's our styling for each individual currency. So that's sort of how to go about finding the CSS that relates to the part of the UI that you're looking to edit. So yeah, you can kind of find it by firstly going to the template that you need to go to, either player or user, and then finding the widget script folder, finding the widget code, going in the widget code, finding the HTML element, and then finding the corresponding CSS for that HTML element. And so we found it. It's this currency CSS here, this block. And this is what I want to make shine in shiny neonness. So now that I've got here, how do I do that? Well, fortunately, the CSS code is relatively straightforward. But if you're not sure or you haven't coded any CSS before, there's plenty of online resources that kind of guide you through the process in writing CSS. One of my favorite is the MDM Mozilla Developer Network, which you can see here. And for this particular one, we're going to be using Box Shadow. So Box Shadow essentially gives us an opportunity to have like a drop shadow behind an element in our HTML. So let's look at using that. Back into the game. So here we go. Let's say I want to make it glow. So let's add a box shadow. Now it sounds counterintuitive because a box shadow sounds like it should be a shadowy thing and not a glowy thing. But it's really kind of like the blurry kind of dark shadow. We're just going to use that, but we're going to make it a bright color instead of a dark color. And you'll see it should look a little bit glowy. Box shadow. Now the first number is the X offset. So on the X, which is left and right, where do we want it? And we actually, to make it glow, we want it 0. If you're looking at doing shadows, you probably want to make it have an offset. So we're going to have 0 on the X offset. We're going to have 0 on the Y offset. Notice how I'm writing this. Box dash shadow colon 0, 0. The next number is the blur, which is the amount of shadow we're going to have here. So let's set it as 5 rem to start with. And then the next number, well, the next number we can use can be just the color that we want to use. So for now, let's just put in white. And I can just spell white because some colors are already, written up in CSS. So white is one of those colors. And now if I save that, Control S, you can see that it's updated. So now we've got like a bit of a shine behind these, or it's kind of like a white shadow essentially. Doesn't look amazing, doesn't look anything like a neon, but we're started. We're off to a good start. It works. That's the main thing. So how do I make it more glowy and look like it's the green color? Well, I'm using the green on this border. This RGBA value is my green color that I'm using. So I'm going to copy that and replace white with that. And now we've got a shiny green. And let's just change this number here, the 5 rem, which if you remember was the spread or how far away from the box our glow will go. If we drop it down, it actually tightens up that glow a little bit. So it gets a bit smaller, but it's a bit more defined as well. So that's that. There is one more number we can use. And if we look here in this code here, we've got the blur radius, which we're using X offset, Y offset, and blur radius. And then we've got spread radius. So we can actually add another one, another number, which will either shrink it or grow it as well. So the blur is how kind of blurry it is at the edge, and the spread is how large it will be. So the first number is the blur, how kind of blurry it is at the edge. And we can drop that right back so it really tightens up and looks like a square. And then let's also do the spread as 5 rem to start with so you can see what's going on. So the spread pulls out that green hazy color, and then the blur just blurs the end of it. So how blurry the end of that is. And so that's kind of the starting point for our glow, right? So we can, let's just drop this to 1 and this to 1. It's a bit full on. So maybe, and I'm using REM as it's a good unit to use because it depends on the screen size. So if someone's playing on 4K or someone's playing HD, then this will grow or shrink accordingly. And actually we can pull this right down to something like 0.2, 0.1. So to start with, that's a kind of glowy effect. A very, very, it's actually a little bit too discreet, isn't it? Let's ramp it up a little bit more than that, the glowy effect. Let's ramp it up a little bit more. So a little bit trial and error, see what happens. There we go. So it's kind of added a little bit of something. Now, if we wanted to like really add some kind of polish to this, we would not stop there. We would do things like take this border and maybe let's get up the view again of it. Take this border and maybe turn it white. Let's just comment out that part of the CSS. So if you have a white border but a colored drop shadow, that can look like the really bright part is actually so bright it's almost white, or it is white, and then the colored glow, it kind of makes it feel like it's a colored neon. So we've got that kind of deal we can use. Another thing is, rather than FFF, which is straight white, we could take this, just add 30 to each of these numbers. So that's like green, but a brighter green. And that's a little bit more subtle, but it actually looks a lot tighter, I think. And so we've got, that's cool. That's like another additional thing. So we've got this border, and we make the border a brighter color than the box shadow. We can actually do multiple box shadows within our box shadow here. So let's do that. So this first one is that kind of bright green. Let's get up our inventory again. We've got 2 now. So they're now overlaying each other. You can put as many box shadows as you like in here. But one thing that might be quite cool is this first one, we'll have it as opacity of 0.8, and the second one will have it opacity of 0.3, and we'll extend it out to twice the size. And so now we've got layers, and we can make lots of layers, and it works quite nicely. It's quite hard to see in the daytime, and this brings me on to an important point. When we're looking at our UI, remember it is there to help the player understand what's going on in the game. It's cool to have it as like, you know, looking fancy and nice effects and things like that, but remember the reason it's there, and that's to give the player information. So when you're doing things like adding glow, you're making things more eye-catching, and so there needs to be a reason that you're taking their eye away from the game. For me, in this game, this cache box, I feel like it blends in too much with the rest of the UI. So I really want to make that stand out as kind of a separate thing apart from the UI. And that's why I might add a glow to it. So that's how to do glowing effects on a box. And you can keep playing with the box shadow and the border colors as you see fit. Might be even quite fun to do multiple colors within that box shadow and see what happens when you layer them over each other. Let's look at another way of adding neon glowy type CSS. But before we do the next one, I think it might be important to change the time of day. Let's set it to 20 past 7, so it's nighttime, because that will really bring out our neon glow. It looks so much better in the dark. I mean, my game's not set up for that. But another thing I should stress, when we're talking about UI, we're talking about giving our players information and making sure it's clear at a glance so that they can see what's going on. So if we're adding effects and things like that, make sure that the contrast is strong enough against the background so that the players can read it and see it quickly at a glance, and it's not getting obfuscated by other things and effects and stuff like that. I think it looks loads better anyway in the dark, so let's keep it like that. Now we're going to have a look at the team, the top left corner. So if I go to my user template, let's go and have a look at team. So I've added this widget myself. If you've got any kind of image in your widgets in your UI with a transparent background, so usually a PNG with a transparent background, then you can look at adding a glow to that. Now at the moment I can't see my team in this dark world that I've made. So let's open up the team widget and see what we can do without changing the image and uploading it. What can we do to make it more visible? I'm going to go to my team widget script, and that's brought it up at the bottom here. So now I'm editing this section up here. Is it the team widget script? No, it's the team widget that I need. That's the one. thought it looked like Lua. No, I'm looking for the HTML and CSS. Okay, so here we are. We've got this team widget, and it's very, very simple. Either shows one image or the other, depending on which team the player's on. The image is displayed using the image tag, which is an HTML tag. So we found our image tag, and there's the corresponding CSS for that. At the moment, it's pretty straightforward. It just positions it. But something really cool we can do, because we're using HTML and CSS, is we can add a filter to that image. And if I wanted to invert it, I can put in a invert function. And how much do I want to invert it? A number between 0 and 100% here, essentially. So let's say I want to invert it completely 1, or I can even put 100% if I wanted to. Doesn't matter. You can do a number between 0 and 1, or a number between 0 and 100%, as long as it's got the percent sign. So there we go. How it works. It displays nicely against the dark night background. If I wanted to invert it halfway, I could, use 0.5 or 50%. So that's a filter that you can use. But like we did with our box shadow, we can have multiple filters on the same element. So we can invert it. But now look, we've got this yellow around our, well, let's bring that in a bit. We've got the yellow around our skull. That's a skull. But this is the blue team. So what if I want to make that yellow back to blue? Well, I've inverted it. So I've turned the black to white. But now I might want to make that yellow blue. I can use a different function, hue-rotate, and that will change the hue, i.e. the color. It won't change black and white. It won't change gray, because they don't have any saturation. They don't have any color already. But if I rotated this by 90 degrees, we can see it's a nice aqua kind of color. If I rotate it by 45 degrees, we're looking at more green. So maybe it's 100 degrees, brings us closer to the blue kind of color. Yeah, something like that. So now we're looking more like blue team. Too far. 200 is purple. So let's rotate it by 160 degrees. That brings us to our blue. Okay. So what else can we do? We don't really have a glow type background on this yet. So let's add a glowy background here. Now this isn't box shadow. This is going to be drop shadow, but it's really similar to box shadow. We put drop shadow and have the open close brackets. I've saved it, so it's returned it to what it was before. And it's really similar CSS to our box shadow. So X offset 0, Y offset 0, color, and blur. It might actually not need commas. There we go. Okay, so we've got X offset, Y offset, blur, and color. We don't have the spread value in the drop shadow filter for our PNG. Just bear that in mind. But that looks way more neon-y and exciting. Let's put this at 1 REM. There we go. So that adds a little bit more neon shine to our... let's go back. Accidentally pressed Windows D instead of Control S. That adds a little bit more neon-y shine. And again, if I wanted to, I could do like a white color, but not necessarily fully opaque. So 0.8 there using RGBA. Yeah, that just might tone it down a little bit. This last number is essentially the opacity, so we can use that to change the strength without changing the spread, the blur of our drop shadow. There we go. So that's another way of adding a glow to some of our UI. So we have our box shadow way, which we looked at with our inventory widget. And to get our UI back up that we were using to edit it, I'm just going to open and close this. Let's get these up so we can see. So we have in our player inventory. So we have our glow around the currency down there, and that was in the inventory view widget, and we added our box shadow and we changed the border color so that it was like a bright version of the same green. And we have our team widget where we used image filters to change the image. Now, notice they're on the image tag itself, so you have to do that in order for them to work, but they work really well. You can use JPEGs as well, although JPEGs won't have that alpha transparency. So they will always be a box, or a square or a rectangular shape. Whereas for my team, I've used a PNG so that I can have it sort of transparently overlaid. Yeah, so we've got the two different types of ways to add glow. Now, if this was daytime and I wanted to do something here, but the glow wouldn't look very good in the day, I could use those same techniques to add box shadows instead. And that would make my UI really pop out and, yeah, really stand out from the background. I would add that we need to use this stuff really sparingly. So when we start to play around with sort of semi-transparent or alpha'd UI effects like glows and drop shadows, they look really cool, but remember that it's overlaying something semi-transparent over the top of essentially a 3D rendered environment, which has its own things like effects like this smoke and lights and stuff like that. And so all of these things can be take quite a lot of resources from the GPU. When we're using effects like this in our UI, that's asking the GPU to do that stuff as well. And the GPU already has quite a lot to do with rendering this game environment, as well as all the other widgets and everything, and all the effects and everything else that's going on, all the lighting. Yeah, so it's asking quite a lot of the GPU. So be kind to the GPUs of your players. When you're using drop shadows or glows, make sure to bear in mind that not everyone's going to have the latest and greatest GPU, and benchmark it using, if you can, get other people to test it and check it out with different setups, and make sure that it's not ruining the experience of your game because you've got a drop shadow over the top of it. So just bear in mind that the drop shadows and the glows might affect the frame rate a little bit and be quite resource heavy for the GPUs. Hopefully this has been an interesting and fun tutorial. For an extension to this, you might want to look at how you can add and remove this stuff in runtime using some of that Lua code that we were looking at. If you get stuck, then head over to the Discord, discord.gg/Crayta, and go to the UI help channel. There'll be plenty of people there wanting to help you out and to achieve what you want to achieve with your game and with your UI. Feel free to jump in the Discord anyway. I'm hanging out there quite a lot at the moment, and I look forward to seeing your UI and your neon coast style UIs in your games in Crayta.